Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the program committee and the committee who choose the Clarkson lectures. Definitely is a huge honor for me to give this. You may feel the same or may not feel the same when I'm done, but it's going to be 50 minutes of fun, or 47:33 at this point. As Eric said, I'm professor and department head at Colorado State University, which is just up the road, about an hour and 5 minutes. At this point, I would traditionally talk about how beautiful the campus is, but really what I want to say is that it's an incredible privilege and an enormous amount of fun to get to lead a group of amazing faculty members, 1,400 undergraduate students, PhD students, master's students, in that endeavor, all of whom buy into this idea that there's a common good that's bigger than your individual greatness. And the fact that people have agreed with that makes my job fantastic, as well as having an enormously supportive dean who might or might not be sitting halfway down the row there. So if you see Dean McCubbin, say nice things. So I'm supposed to disclose relationships that might cause me to have bias or some kind of conflict of interest, and this is the one I'm required to disclose. But in the interest of full disclosure, I really think we should do a better job of this and lay it out there. If we're going to disclose, then let's disclose. So I am biased in numerous ways. Many of my interests are in conflict. I'm wrong often. Given new information, I've been known to change my mind. So those are my disclosures. So there are many biases and many conflicts, all of which I totally own. So the title of this talk was not an accident, and it wasn't designed to anger all of the Exercise as Medicine people. That was just an added side bonus. But I really do want to make a point, and it may not be the point that you think I'm going to make, but clearly the idea of exercise as medicine has been successfully purveyed and transmitted to a wide audience, which is terrific, all across the world. But what I really want to talk about is this idea, the idea of exercise as medicine with the idea of exercise really as medication, because I feel like that's what's gotten conflated, is the medicine part of exercise and the medication part of exercise. And that's really going to be, I hope, my theme today. So, like everybody else, and being as pedantic as any academic, I went and looked up the definition of medicine and chose the ones that I wanted, of course. So the obvious one, or the one that I think is clearly relevant, is the science and art dealing with maintenance of health and prevention, alleviation, and cure of disease. I think equally apropos is something that affects well-being. And it's pretty hard to argue with these two. Given those two definitions, is exercise medicine? Of course. Does it affect well-being in a positive way? Of course. To quote a famous line from the movie, A Few Good Men, these are the facts and they are undisputed. But, does exercise work if we define medicine as a substance or preparation used in treating disease, in other words, a medication? I think that's where it starts to fall apart a bit for me. Uh-oh. Phil, it stopped working. Oh, we're back. So if you take a medication, a pharmaceutical medication, in this case it's metformin, and it comes with 27 pages of operating instructions, and some of those operating instructions, or all of them, are very specific. The side effects, the pharmacokinetics, the pharmacodynamics, this is just how you start giving it to people, which requires a paragraph in itself about how to start giving it, how you increase, what the maximum dose could be. So here, the maximum daily dose, 2,550 milligrams per day. Not about 2,500, not somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000, right? 2,550, it's very specific. On the other hand, and I know that most of the people who developed the 2008 physical activity guidelines are sitting in this room, so my point is not to diss the people who made the guidelines, and I know they're being updated for 2018, but the guidelines are a little less specific for physical activity than they are for pharmaceuticals. So we have just some highlights. Some physical activity is better than none. Preferably, it should spread throughout the week. Additional health benefits are gained beyond this amount, all of which is true. But if you were to go to a physician with a problem and they were to give you a prescription for a medication and they were going to give it in a way that would be akin to our exercise recommendations, the prescription would look like this, right? A few pills is better than none. More pills are even better. Take them most days of the week and try not to miss a lot of days in a row. So if a physician gave you that prescription, I assume you would go and try to find another physician. So what we need, if we're really going to think about exercise as a medicine, not medicine, but a medicine, are things like, what's the target? Clearly, the target can't be the same for preventing cancer as it is for alleviating anxiety, as it is for reducing the risk for type 2 diabetes. There are mechanisms, and we don't really understand them very well, although the Motor Pack initiative means that in 5 or 6 years we're going to know a lot, but at the moment we don't. Something about the dose-response relationship between exercise and response, and that could be mode, that could be intensity, that could be frequency, that could be duration, but there's a lot of pieces that go into how the dose is translated to a response. Interactions with food, every medication has interactions with food, every medication has interactions with other medications, and every medication has side effects. So these are the things we're going to need to work out if we're going to think about exercise as medicine in the sense of akin to a pharmaceutical or pharmacologic agent. And by the way, I don't actually belong to the Fort Collins Country Club. I just had a meeting there once and stole their stationery. So what I wanted to talk about, because I'm most familiar with it, and I assume that the committee who asked me to do this wanted me to talk about my own work, or they would have gotten somebody else, is insulin resistance, prediabetes, and how exercise plays into the risk for and the management of prediabetes and diabetes. So I always show this slide because back in the days when PowerPoint was new, it took me about 3 weeks to make it, and I'm going to get my money's worth out of this. And in this case, the blood is red, the liver is shaped like a liver, the muscle is striated, the fat is yellow, the glucose molecules are green because green glucose, so you get it. And the pancreatic islet cells are labeled pancreatic islet cells. And in the fasted state, most of the glucose in the blood is being produced by the liver and really going to support the central nervous system. But in response to a carbohydrate-containing meal, blood glucose goes up. In response, insulin is produced by the pancreatic islet cells. It binds to receptors, muscle, liver, and fat. And then what's supposed to happen is that they get great uptake of glucose from the blood into the muscle, uptake of glucose from the blood into the fat, and suppression of hepatic glucose production. But in people who are insulin resistant, what you get instead is a vanishingly small uptake into the fat, a small uptake into the muscle, and really inadequate suppression of hepatic glucose production. In response, the pancreas, being a smart organ, makes more insulin. So you have a bigger increase in insulin, binding to more receptors, and in response, you can drive glucose uptake into muscle, glucose uptake into fat, and suppress liver glucose production. And as long as you can produce massive amounts of insulin, this works. So the key here is that as long as people can maintain hyperinsulinemia, they're not going to get type 2 diabetes. But for most people, or many people, at some point the pancreas no longer can maintain that prodigious insulin production, and you tip over into overt type 2 diabetes. So really what exercise is doing, in the sense of making people more insulin sensitive, is preserving beta cell function, right? Supply and demand. If the demand for insulin is lower, you can get away with less supply, which makes your beta cells last longer, which reduces your risk to transition from prediabetes to diabetes. Good so far? Okay. So just in terms of the scope of the problem, prediabetes is a huge issue because there's so many people involved. So the people, if put it in perspective, the number of people in the United States with type 1 diabetes is about 1.25 million, which is approximately the same as the number of people in the United States named Linda, if that helps. Type 2 diabetes is about 29 million, which is about the same number of people as are left-handed. But prediabetes is a much bigger issue because it's 79 or so million, which is the Lindas, plus the left-handed people, plus the 6 million Jewish people, plus the 43 million households that own dogs. So you can see from that that it's a much bigger issue than either form of diabetes in terms of absolute numbers. And the NIH certainly recognized this, as other organizations have, and created what is still kind of the grandfather of them all in terms of diabetes prevention, the multi-center diabetes prevention program. The main data were published first in 2001, but papers still are coming out as people do sub-analyses of these 3,300 people stratified into 3 groups. One group, and these are people who had prediabetes, impaired glucose tolerance, elevated fasting glucose. And the one thing to take home is how high risk these people really are, in that in 4 years, almost 40% of this population had tipped over from prediabetes to diabetes. That's that red line up top. Metformin was effective to reduce that transition by about 28 or 30%, but yay for us, lifestyle was even better, and there was somewhere between a 55 and 60% reduction in that transition from prediabetes to diabetes in the people who got this low-fat, low-calorie diet, bless you, and 150 minutes of exercise a week. I can multitask. Maybe. So part of that, so there's multi-facets to that. There's a nutritional piece and there's an exercise piece, but we know and have known for a long time, so this is a study from 1986, John Hollisley's group, showing that men with type 2 diabetes put on a year-long intensive training program actually had their diabetes reversed. So here's their glucose on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, response to a glucose tolerance test. This is their blood sugar pre-training, peaking at almost 300 milligrams per deciliter. Post-training, they're up here at about 170. Their fasting glucose is almost normal. So we know that training itself has a major effect on the transition from prediabetes to diabetes, and can even potentially reverse diabetes. As you probably know, the study all done in men, because in 1986, women hadn't been discovered yet. So there are pieces of this that involve lifestyle change transmitted through weight loss, and also habitual activity, which may or may not require weight loss with a beneficial impact on metabolic health. But it gets more complicated because we know from dozens of studies, some of which have been done by people in this room, that every single bout of exercise has an insulin sensitizing effect, like a drug. You take the drug, it lasts for some period of time, and depending on the dose, meaning mode, frequency, duration, interaction with post-exercise food, and interaction with other medications, you get some benefit on metabolic health, and how long that effect lasts and how big that effect is obviously modulated by many, many factors. So here's one of those studies. In this case, it's women with type 2 diabetes, recently diagnosed, still actually somewhat hyperinsulinemic, not on any medications. They went through 3 different interventions, or one intervention with 3 different pieces. In one of them, there was no exercise. In one of them, they did 3 bouts of exercise over the course of 2 days, 750 calories exactly, 250 calories times 3 over the course of 2 days, with insulin sensitivity measured the next day using the insulin suppression test, which used to be similar to the glucose clamp until it sort of fell out of favor. In this case, you infuse both glucose and insulin, and the more sensitive you are, the lower your steady state plasma glucose. So lower is good, higher is bad. Here's where they plateaued without exercise at about 11 millimolar. They did the exercise in 2 conditions. In one condition, high intensity, short duration, still 750 calories. In the other condition, low intensity, longer duration, but again, exactly 750 calories. The only difference was the intensity. And in this study, it made no difference whether or not they did it at high and low intensity. Same energy expenditure, same response. One of the questions that came up is, well, in the condition when they're not doing exercise, they're getting fed a metabolic diet equal to their energy expenditure. But then when you do the 750 calories of exercise, if you don't feed those calories back, now the participants are in an energy deficit as well as getting an exercise intervention. That's 2 variables. That's not the way we like to do things. But if you feed the calories back, it might not work, and the exercise might do nothing, and nobody's ever going to publish the paper. So in this case, the authors chose to not feed the calories back with the excuse that nobody else ever feeds the calories back. And if the paper doesn't show any positive results, it's never going to be published. And these people should have known better, because this was my PhD work. So, and I did my PhD in nutrition. So I knew what we were doing, and I knew that I had introduced a confounding variable. And as I said, my only response was, well, everybody else does it that way too. Luckily, I felt badly about it, which is the first step to redemption, I think. And I had the right PhD student in the right situation at the right time, Colonel Steve Black, who came and actually took this on as a question, took a group of people with prediabetes, stratified them into two groups, an energy deficit group and an energy balance group, put them on a weight maintenance diet for 7 days, measured insulin action before the intervention, then had them do 6 days of exercise in a row, 500 calories a day, walking on the treadmill, and then the next day measured insulin action again. And what Steve did is, try to create a situation where, in one case, did not feed back those 500 calories, so they were in a deficit, and the other case did feed back those 500 calories, so they're basically in energy balance. Is it really possible to know that the energy deficit was minus 481 plus or minus 24 calories a day? No. It's an estimate based on the tools that we have, which, as many of you know, are not as precise as we'd like in terms of knowing an exact calorie intake and expenditure. And what Steve found surprised us. We both thought that the energy balance was going to matter, but we didn't expect that in the condition when they were in deficit, in red, like red deficit, I'm not that clever, they had a big increase in insulin action the next day after the 6 days of exercise. Again, not new. Other people have shown this. We've shown this. Half the world has shown this. So glucose turnover measured as glucose rate of disappearance per kilogram fat-free mass on the y-axis. The deficit condition, 30% increase, just like everybody else sees. The energy balance condition, nothing. 6 days of exercise did absolutely nothing for them in terms of their glucose uptake. Their hepatic glucose suppression was exactly the same, nothing. It was like they hadn't exercised at all for these outcome measures. But reviewers of this paper and others were happy to point out that there was another confounding variable that we had not considered, which we actually had considered but hoped nobody else would, that if you give them the same same composition of diet, but change the number of calories, you also give people more carbohydrate. There's no way around that. If you keep the balance of carbohydrate, fat, and protein the same and change the number of calories, you get more carbohydrate. So reviewers were happy to point out that it might not be the calories themselves, it might be the fact that people were getting a lot of more carbohydrate in the balanced condition than they were in the deficit condition. And people have shown, we've shown, but better, Jeff Horowitz's lab, Greg Carty, have shown that the composition of the calories matter. And in this case, if you replace energy with nothing but lipid, it's really the same as replacing it with saline. So the carbohydrate content of the post-exercise diet really matters. And we know that if you have an athlete and you want them to replenish their glycogen as quickly as possible, you feed them a lot of carbohydrate right after exercise. That works great if your next goal is performance, not so great if your next goal is to do a glucose clamp and see how insulin sensitive the person is. So that kind of led us to other situations where we could look at the interactions between energy expenditure and energy intake. So around the time that sedentary behavior, sitting, and inactivity were being compared to anthrax, with I think a lot of people thinking that maybe chairs were more toxic than anthrax, I would go to meetings like this, and Mark Hamilton, who was really, a big proponent of sitting is toxic, we would argue, and he would say sitting is toxic, and I would say, how do you know? When you do these studies, you don't cut back their calories, so they're now sitting more, you're feeding them the same number of calories, so now they're in an energy surplus. So how do you know it's the sitting and not the energy surplus? And we did what scientists do. He would say, you're wrong, and I would say, no, you're wrong, and he would say, you're stupid, and I'd say, so we would, argue and throw things at each other and call each other names, and that was fun, but at some point decided that, we could do better, and so we actually collaborated on a study of inactivity, and this was the study that became Brooke Hassan's thesis dissertation work. And she looked at 14 young men and women in 3 conditions. 15 hours. She took them and put them or tested them in 3 conditions. In one condition, they were active all day, no exercise, but just moving, standing, walking slowly, cleaning out the refrigerator, doing a lot of things that were helpful in the lab, reorganizing all our journals. The study was just awesome. And their energy intake and expenditure were approximately the same, and they were active all day long. We also had them sleep in the lab overnight because we didn't want to mess up the conditions. We wanted the inactive people to be inactive, the active people to be active. And when we did the measurement the next morning, we couldn't trust that they weren't going to go home and play basketball or do something they weren't supposed to do. So they slept in the lab. So we had pretty good experimental control. In another condition, they sat for those 15 hours. And we didn't actually change their diet. So now they're expending only 2,200 calories, but getting fed 3,100. So they're in a big energy surplus. And then the third condition, we tested the effective energy surplus by cutting back their diet. So now they're sitting for 15 hours, but only getting 2,100 calories a day. So they're in energy balance again. So what it looked like visually is here's the active day. Blue is sitting, red is standing, green is actually moving, and purple is sleep. And then the 2 inactive days, you can see that it's basically sit and sleep. That's the entirety of their movement. If they needed to go to the bathroom, Brooke put them in a wheelchair and wheeled them down to the bathroom because we really wanted to see what happens if you make people sit, really sit for 15 hours at a time. And the answer is not, good things don't happen. And so what we found, and again, this is using stable isotope tracers to look at the uptake of glucose. So higher is better, bigger uptake of glucose. This is the active condition, and then here are the 2 inactive conditions. In this case, we didn't change their diet, so they're in energy surplus. And taking young, healthy people and making them sit for 15 hours, we managed to decrease their insulin sensitivity by almost 40% in just 1 day. So it is actually a pretty profound stimulus. And if we cut back their calories, that was attenuated and the decline was still significant, but only 18%. So part of it appears to be directly related to sitting. Part of it, at least in this model, short-term, healthy people. This is not necessarily applicable to the entire population of obese, overweight, or insulin-resistant people. It seems as though there's an effect of both energy surplus and sitting itself. Or as I like to tell Mark, it was 53% energy surplus and 47% sitting. So basically, I was right and he was wrong. So this idea, and if it's not obvious, and it may not be, I'm trying to build up the idea that if we want to look at exercise as a medication, there are a lot of confounding variables that we're going to have to consider, to the point of maybe this isn't actually possible to do this in a systematic way. We're going to have to consider not just exercise training and weight loss and acute exercise, but the timing, energy balance, and meal carbohydrate following each bout of exercise, the impact of sitting along with those factors, and I haven't even gotten to the pharmacology yet in terms of the added interactions between physical activity and the many medications that people are taking. So people looked at this, and I think a lot of people did what we did when they first saw it. Looked at the metformin effect, looked at the lifestyle effect, and thought, I wonder what would happen if you did both. And all I can say, and I don't think that's a phenomenal leap of scientific insight. I think probably any 8-year-old could have thought of that. We just happened to think of it really quickly and got our grant proposals in before other people did, and got some funding from the American Diabetes Association and then NIH to actually look at the interplay between exercise and metformin. And it started with Carrie Sharoff's dissertation, where we looked at this and thought, well, you know, the lifestyle impact, especially the exercise, is mostly on muscle and insulin action, or muscle insulin action, and postprandial glucose, whereas metformin is mostly liver gluconeogenesis and hepatic glucose production, and an impact on fasting glucose. So if we put them together, we should get an even bigger effect than alone. In other words, in our very simplistic way of thinking, 1 + 1 would equal something like 2. Which the pharmacologists like Adam in the front row have since pointed out to me, just shows how little we know about pharmacology. And we had 2 questions. One, what happens with acute exercise? And second, what would happen if you did this over time in a training study? So what Carrie did was do the acute exercise study, and we had two groups, a metformin group and a placebo group. As it turned out, doing this as a crossover became logistically impossible. And in one case, they were on placebo for 8 weeks, got a muscle biopsy, and then we did either did 40 minutes of rest or 40 minutes of exercise, a stable isotope infusion, and then a 2-hour euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp the next day. I just want to call out thanks to Lori Goodyear's lab for helping us a lot with a lot of the intracellular mediators that we got from the muscle biopsies here. That was a huge help for us. And then there was a metformin condition where we actually measured them 3 times because we needed a pre-metformin, a post-metformin, and then a rest and exercise condition. So what she found, and I'm not going to show the actual data because we have a symposium on this tomorrow on pharmacology and exercise, so I don't want to duplicate too much, is that insulin sensitivity went up a lot with the exercise alone, almost completely blunted with the addition of metformin. Hepatic insulin sensitivity also had a big effect of exercise alone, totally blunted by metformin. AMPK activation in the muscle was increased a lot, and increased slightly, but not nearly as much with metformin. And we also were curious as to whether this was driven by a difference in glycogen utilization between the two protocols. Didn't matter. Metformin or no metformin, the use of glycogen as an energy source during the exercise was exactly the same. So that led us to Steve Mallon's dissertation work, where he looked at whether metformin blunts the beneficial effects of training in addition to or as opposed to just individual exercise bouts. And what Steve did was take 32 men and women with impaired glucose tolerance and then had 4 arms of this study, 12 weeks of placebo, 12 weeks of metformin, 12 weeks of training with placebo, 12 weeks of training with metformin. And then again measured insulin sensitivity by glucose clamp and isotopic tracers. And just to give you one piece of data, here's the placebo group, the metformin group, the exercise and placebo group, the exercise and metformin group. Again, glucose uptake as measured by uptake of stable isotope tracer on the y-axis. So again, higher is good, lower is bad. Not much change in the placebo group. We got an effect of metformin alone, big effect of exercise training alone, and that was considerably attenuated when we put the exercise and the metformin together again. And we have 7 or 8 different outcomes that show an attenuated effect of exercise when added to metformin, although as I'll show tomorrow, there are a couple of outcomes where they actually did work a little bit additively, so it's not completely consistent. But one of the things that we're finding is it's not just us and it's not just metformin. In the last couple of years, other groups, John Tifo and the group in Missouri, showed that on statin medications, the increase in VO2 peak after training was greatly blunted. This is exercise alone. This is statin and exercise, much smaller increase in VO2 max. This is one of the resveratrol studies looking at responders and the amount of response to resveratrol on VO2 max with training, and here's the group that's getting the resveratrol, here's the placebo group. So there are other situations where it appears that these metabolic medications don't augment exercise. In fact, they may attenuate the effects of exercise. So where am I going with all this? I started to think about, given all of these confounding variables, the different targets, the different doses, the different responses, the different populations, the different diseases, could I start to help the committee designing the physical activity guidelines a little bit with some insight as to what kinds of targets we should be looking at and what kinds of exercise recommendations you might have. And so I started with this exercise medicine targets and just started building a sort of library of different conditions where exercise could be used as medicine. And I didn't stop because I ran out of targets. I stopped because I ran out of room and I didn't want to erase this and write it all over again. But it gets even more complicated. It's not just diabetes, but type 1, type 2, type 1 with pump, type 1 without pump, preventing obesity. You have weight loss. You have trying to maintain the lost weight after you've already lost it. Depression, all the different forms of cancer. Cancer post-treatment, cancer while people are still being treated. So it's fraught with all kinds of confounding variables. And I haven't even added back diet interactions, sleep interactions, stress, medications, sex, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and age, all of which are clearly going to play a role in mediating/modulating the dose-response relationship between exercise and outcome. So, rather than getting depressed, I decided that I would try to think about this differently and try to figure out, are there situations in which exercise really is likely to be useful as a medication, and we really need to know mechanism, and we really need to know a pretty precise dose response? And are there other situations when we don't, where a rough dose response might be useful? Or maybe even dose response isn't even the highest priority. Maybe it's least effective dose that really needs to be the most important thing. Compliance. Maybe those are the big issues, and mechanism and precise dose response may not be as critical. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, and I really was just kind of making stuff up. Educated guessing, because I have a PhD, so it's educated guessing, that we really are looking at exercise as medicine in a form of prevention. And I just threw out the idea of cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, areas where clearly there's a big role for exercise, physical activity, removal of sedentary behavior in the prevention or reduction in the incidence/prevalence of these things. And in that case, it may only be necessary to know a rough dose response. Maybe we don't need to know that if you add 5 more minutes, you get an X% decrease in the risk for coronary artery disease. And each 5 minutes gives you more or less. And the exact role of intensity and the exact role of duration and the exact role of mode and the exact interactions with other factors, that maybe a rough dose response is sufficient. And that the key really is to figure out how to maximize compliance and also how it interacts with diet and the other medications that these people are likely to be on, things like statins, things like metformin, things like beta blockers. On the other hand, we also use exercise as therapy, and the examples that came to mind were multiple sclerosis, other gait and balance disorders, heart failure, depression, where, again, a precise dose response may not be necessary and a precise mechanism may not even be absolutely critical. There was a lot we could do without knowing those things. And in that case, the least effective dose, how little can you do and still get a benefit? It would be really useful for somebody with heart failure or peripheral artery disease or multiple sclerosis. Where the constraints to exercising are high. There are a lot of barriers, and what we really could use is knowing how little can you do and still get a benefit. Again, knowing that more is probably better. And safety. People with MS who exercise tend to become somewhat hyperthermic, and it can set them back for weeks if they do. And the mode. In this case, I'm just going to keep using MS as an example. We know that people with MS tend to respond better in some ways to exercise in water because you reduce that hyperthermic response. People regulate their body temperature better and often don't have that negative effect following exercise. On the other hand, there are situations when exercise really is going to be useful as a medication. And diabetes is probably the easiest example to use, especially type 1 or insulin-treated diabetes, where if you don't get the dose right in combination with your exercise, either you're not going to see much reduction in blood sugar, or you're going to get hypoglycemic, pass out, and possibly die. So if you don't tweak the insulin regimen in response to an hour of exercise, bad things are going to happen. So we really do need to know a lot about the relationship between exercise dose, insulin dose, and response. That's not one where I think a rough dose response is going to be sufficient. And there are probably other things that are like that as well. In addition to just preventing cancer, there's a whole world of people, Reed is sitting here in the audience today, or at least he was if he didn't run out, who are looking at the effects of exercise in people who are in active cancer treatment. And there's an interaction with chemotherapy there. And again, probably a more precise dose response between how much do we need to do to show a positive benefit versus how much do we do that actually is going to cause harm. That's going to be an important consideration. So mechanism and potential side effects are probably really important in this bin. So to take all these pieces together, I thought it was worth thinking about when we talk about exercise is medicine. Are we talking about it as primarily prevention, Are we talking about it primarily as therapy, or are we talking about it primarily as a medication? Because the strategies in terms of what studies do we need to do, who do we need to do those studies on, what kinds of things do we need to combine the exercise with, I think are going to be tailored to the big question to be asked. I mean, is it for prevention, is it for therapy, or is it a medication? So far from what you might have expected, which I was going to say that exercise is somehow less than medicine, I would argue that medicine is actually less than exercise. So some final thoughts, and full disclosure, they're not my final thoughts. I actually have 2 slides after this. Is that I often think, that we don't talk about sleep as medicine. Maybe the sleep people talk about sleep as medicine, but it's a similar kind of situation in that, we do know that there's a minimum dose below which people do not feel well and are at greater risk for all kinds of things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. That more sleep is better, that 6 hours is probably better than 4, that 8 hours might be better than 6, but there's an upper limit. 12 hours is probably not better than 8. And in fact, there's probably some harm that comes with sleeping 12 hours a day as opposed to 8. So there's a limit where there's probably no further benefit, and in fact, you might even see a detriment. And like as with exercise, the individual variability in response is going to be enormous, from people who start exercising and actually get worse to people who, so there are people who start doing cardiovascular training and their VO2 max goes down. I know it's not a lot of people, but it happens. You do a study with 300 people and 2 or 3 of them are going to have a lower VO2 max after 12 weeks of training. I know it seems impossible. And some of them are going to have a 40% increase given the same protocol. And so the blanket recommendations, and this is where I really feel like the people who have to make the guidelines are in a no-win situation, is there's no way the blanket guidelines will ever apply to an individual, which drives the public crazy when you tell them that they hear these guidelines, oh, but they don't apply to you because they're for populations, not for people. People don't respond well to that, as it turns out. So that is something that is always going to be an issue here, is that the recommendations are always going to be constrained to averages and really apply to 0 individual people. The other piece that I wanted to bring up is the idea of open-minded skepticism, which is a term that I may have made up, or I may have stolen it from the internet, and I'm really not sure. And if I have stolen it from the internet, then I apologize to whoever I stole it from. But the idea that, given, and this is probably mostly for students in the room, the idea that, when presented with new information, my reaction is, I don't believe you unless you can convince me. But if you can convince me with actual evidence, then I will believe you. So the key is to be skeptical, but open-minded enough to not dismiss everything. And so, and that's one of the things I wanted to highlight in terms of just choosing the title, Is Exercise Really Medicine?, is to look at those things that we all tend to accept with that sort of open-minded skepticism, whether it's what is magical about 10,000 steps a day that isn't magical about 9,500 or 11,000 or 13,000. Since my PhD is in nutrition, I can critique the idea of 5 fruits and vegetables a day as somehow being optimal for health. I'm still a little curious as to how 5 fruits and 0 vegetables is exactly the same as 0 fruits and 5 vegetables. So I'm not really sure, how much weight to put on this idea that 5 fruits or vegetables a day is going to somehow be related to optimal health. And then my current favorite, which I'm sure other people will disagree with, the idea that obesity and obesity-related disease costs the economy billions of dollars a year. I would argue, and I've had this argument with economists, that obesity and obesity-related disease actually cost us $0 a year, but that's an argument for another day. And then lastly, although Dr. Rawson pointed out that he thinks Priscilla would have been ecstatic that I was giving this talk, I can tell you, and probably most of the people who know her, that she would have been appalled at the way I gave the talk. And that I think I broke every one of her rules, of which there were many. Ed Melanson is nodding, except I didn't have my hair in my eyes. I think that's the only rule I have managed to not break here. And this is just a shout out to all the number of students who have come through the lab over the course of the years, and some phenomenal collaborators that I've gotten to work with, and our funding agencies. But then I was having breakfast this morning, and in walks Ron Mon. And you know that Ron is a fantastically interesting person, those of you who know him, and there's almost guaranteed that whatever you talk about is going to degenerate into something really interesting. And we got to talking about people. And the idea that, there were these names that we hear, and all of us have heard them, and often forget that there were people attached to them. The Clarkson lecture is about Priscilla Clarkson. The D.B. Dill lecture is about D.B. Dill, who I never met, and I don't know nearly enough about him. There are people alive who know Hans Krebs. He's not just a pathway, he was actually a person. And those people tell stories about him that really bring him to life. So it really got me thinking about that idea of these kinds of named lectures and how easy it is to call it the Clarkson Lecture or the Butterfield Travel Award and kind of lose sight of the person and the history that went into that individual. So it got me thinking about a phrase which I think has got to be a Western phrase, because it doesn't seem like anything somebody would say in the East. And that is, if you're going to drink the water, remember who dug the well. So I just wanted to finish by showing you all the people who have dug the well for me. And whether it was as an undergraduate, whether it was as a technician in a biophysics lab, whether it was as a graduate student at UMass Amherst, where I really learned the true meaning of a collaborative study, where there really were no barriers and people worked together seamlessly in a way that we often talk about but don't always practice. As a PhD student, as a postdoc, working with Gail and George and other people, we're really learning the value of a great team and how much you can accomplish when everybody checks their ego at the door and just looks at the task at hand and gets it done, whether it's infusing stable isotopes or sweeping the lab floor. Nobody's degree and nobody's title meant anything in that situation, and it's amazing what you can do when nobody cares about who gets credit. To my years at UMass Amherst, where, and you can see Priscilla appears twice here, once as a student and then once as a faculty member. And again, that idea of people looking out for each other, people working together. I shared an office with Priscilla for 5 years. I was a brand new assistant professor. She was a full professor. She did not have to share her office with me. It was her idea. And that's the kind of lack of ego, that's the kind of, trying to, what can I do to make the situation as good as it can, rather than what can I do to make myself look as good as I can, that I've always appreciated about many of the people I've worked with, and certainly appreciated about Priscilla, all of which have kind of conspired to get me here, both the actual people and the imaginary people who've also had a big impact on me over the years. So with that, I've learned that, people never hate it when you end a lecture early. So with 5 minutes and 38 seconds left, I'm going to say thank you very much.